Okay, everybody, thank you for being here for what is going to be a very interesting discussion on this panel that has a very suggestive title, Reporting from the Future, Architecture, Material and Construction Techniques of Modern Times. I am David Basulto, founder and editor-in-chief of Arc Daily, and today we not only have a group of practicing architects who from the field, by building and researching, are bringing the future today, but also we have an architectural startup that is really shaping the future of architecture, in my opinion. So today we are going to have this discussion with Yosuke Hayano, a partner at Mad Architects from Beijing, Boris Bernasconi, founder of Bernasconi Architects here in Moscow, Hani Rashid, founder of Asymptote Architects from New York, and with Reina de Graaff, partner at the Office of Metropolitan Architecture in Rotterdam, and with Marko Mihijetfik from Delano here in Moscow. Well, buildings have a long lifespan, and they have to accommodate to an uncertain future. What we design today will have to last 50 more years, and we don't know what could happen. Each of the experts here have unique visions, and we ask them to make short presentations, 5 minutes long, to show us through their recent projects how are they addressing the future today and how the technologies are shaping their work, if they have an influence or not. So to start, I invite Mr. Hayano from Mad Architects to tell us how he's addressing the future today.
Okay, thanks, David. I'm Yosuke Hayano from MAD Architects.
Don't trust the clicker.
Well,
Don't trust the clicker. Can you help us?
okay, so maybe I just start with that. Okay, so our office is based in Beijing, the capital of China. We have 3 partners, 2 are Chinese and I'm Japanese, so we are very Asian kind of oriented. So we're trying to put more Asian kind of thinking into contemporary architecture design. Oh, yes.
No. Oh, no.
Maybe next?
Can you do it manually?
Yeah.
So next, click.
Okay. Oh, okay. That way.
You have to point behind you to make it.
Okay, that works. So, like, this is Beijing. So we have 3 partners: Ma, Dan Yansan, Dan Chun. They are Chinese, and I'm Japanese. So in recent years, we are trying to put the Shanshui city as a concept of the future city, because we believe we are entering the time which we have to redefine what is the vision for the future city. Because in Moscow, London, Tokyo, New York, all the cities are trying to reform and trying to be more adapted for the current social change. So we are thinking not like doing individual project as individual project to respond to each demand, but we should reform the vision for the future city, which is more involving people, like more involving as a nature, as a beginning, not as an individual response. Okay, so talk about our office approach to the technology. I want to share some story in our office history. At 2005, we won the competition in Toronto, Canada, to do the Twin Tower. It's called the Absolute Tower. At the more or less same time, we had the opportunity to do the museum design in Ordos, which is one Chinese city in the north part. So doing these 2 projects parallelly, we had a totally different experience about technology or construction. So for this Ordos project, we try to, because it's complex, it's applying like complex geometry, so we try to make very precise drawing, the architecture model. But at certain point, at the end, we end up, we really have to work with local workers who has no idea what is computing design, what is the digital fabrication, what is grasshopper, etc., etc. But they work with their experience. They work with their hand. So at the beginning, we really depressed, disappointed by losing the control of the quality. But at a certain point, we realized that we architects has to change the way of thinking, because this is a fact. We have to live with it. So that we have to use our creativity, imagination, to come up with a new kind of approach for the material, for the construction, to work with this tolerance of the hand. So that is kind of the story. Then recent two projects which we completed, one is the Opera House, another is the kindergarten in Japan. Like we put this kind of experience into the design phase. So quickly I'm going to go through what kind of challenge we had like in the Opera House. This is Harbin Opera House. Harbin is a north city in China, which has a huge cultural influence from Russia. So because the local government decided to develop new cultural island in the north part of the city, which involve two buildings. One is Opera House, another is Convention Center, which our office doing overall design for the island, the Opera House and the Convention Center. Because the city located in the very north, in the winter time, it's going minus 30 or minus 40 degrees. On the summertime, it's going more than 30 degrees. So the first challenge is about facade, skin. So how this material behavior can respond to this temperature difference. Also like how we can work with still local workers, the notion of the hand. So also like from a design point of view, we had like a challenge like to have a design in different scale. From distance, like we want to have like a two massive like snow mountain, but once you get close in architecture scale, we want to see more different things, more material definition. Then once you get more close in human scale, you see something like more bump. These kind of things, like you see some different treatment on the skin to make more different architectural expression. So we spend a lot of time in digital way, also in the physical way, to make sure how this construction can work with the local construction method. So this bump, like of course, we took a lot of time to develop by the grasshopper, the definition, then to bring this data to the three-dimensional pressing machine, which is quite new for us as well. But at the end, we test in the one-to-one mock-up to how this angle correct the air pollution, which is a big issue in China as well. Then how nano coating can clean by itself, so on and so on. So at the end, it's came up quite well in terms of the design. The second challenge for this project, we call it wood shell, because Opera House is very sensitive for the voice and the music as well. So that's why once you go in, then we wanted to have this main hall as kind of music instrument, which has like wood kind of finishing. So this is the main hall once you get in. So this is from inside. So inside and outside, also like a really three-dimensional organic wood finishing. But again, to make this happen in three-dimensional organic way with real wood is very challenging. Then also like we had challenge, like we want to carry on this idea to have design respond to the different scale. So once people get close, people going to see something different. So depends on the relationship with the people, we try to make different kind of Ruba design. So we took many different mock-up to make it happen. So at the end, it's really interesting for us because we try to make a perfect 3D model and deliver to the contractor, but they said they couldn't do it. But we tell them what is the principle of this design. So they figure out by themselves, by hand, by manually. So that's why sometimes manual go beyond the digital. So that was quite an interesting thing. But like overall, this project was really, for us, it's really good experience to put digital and manual put into the together. The next project is Clover House. It's a small kindergarten project in Japan. So this, again, this project is not in Tokyo or Osaka. It's like a big city, but it's very small city. It's my hometown. So it's a very rural site. And then client started this business of kindergarten to give education for the kids in Japanese, English, and Chinese in the housing kind of environment. So they started this business in their parents' house, which they grew up. So they asked us to demolish this to make new housing, but we said this house has lots of memory as a family, as a the kindergarten. So we said we're gonna keep this wood frame and structure, then use in the new frame. Then we're gonna make new kind of wood shell to cover it to make in between space. So this is the initial concept design. So this is existing. So we carefully demolish, then decide with structure engineer which one we can use for the future. Then one by one we take like which one gonna keep it. Then we're gonna we move to the somewhere else to keep it. Then this is the beginning of the new building start. So we put this frame. So challenge for this, like because wood structure is very common in Japan, but creating this kind of organic three-dimensional shape is very, very challenging. Also, like a contractor is not like a high level, but it's very local. So we work with them very carefully, and then we produce all three-dimensional different drawing for them to make sure, especially for the joint part. It's very, very difficult. Also, like we found that it's very difficult on site to put it. So we spend like a few days to this joint work. So then after that, we make this base surface so. Then this is the final. So we the back side, they respond to the surrounding normal housing typology, but the front part, they become more organic to merge into the landscape. So the inside, you can see is old and new conversation. So creating a little bit weird, interesting between space. Then this is the top, like library. So this is top. So this is the final one. So for in short conclusion as my speech, I think it's an important thing, like because digital technology give us a lot of possibility to see what we couldn't see before, but like it's not to make this technology as design, but like an important thing, we have something to wanna design, then we're gonna use technology to help us to achieve it. I think that is most important thing to be clear. And also like this technology has very local or traditional meaning behind it. So that's why we carefully have to observe the meaning behind it to use for the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Yosuke. For sure that the technical possibilities of today allow us to think beyond the form, but to be able to build that with local craftsmanship is the real challenge, as you show us in the Harbin project. So now we're going to see how this is being addressed here from Moscow with Boris Bernasconi.
Да, а презентацию можно поставить?
Would you put my presentation on? Put it on the screen. Well, I'd like to tell you about our startup company in Skolkovo. I'll speak in Russian because I won't be able to speak quite so fast in English as my colleague from MAD. Well, it was the first Skolkovo building, and we even published a book about that building, 512 lines of research on how a building can become a startup, how can architecture can become a startup, and also about how aesthetics of all the functions of the building and the ideology and the building's ideology and technology can change as we go, as when all these parameters are topped with another one, that is time. Hypercube, that's where the title comes from. It's a four-dimensional cube, how time affects our work. All buildings have long lifetimes, and it's not clear what happens with the lives of those buildings, and we can never know who's going to own the building in the future, like in China. Buildings get demolished, and buildings, in China, there are cases when buildings were demolished only 2 or 3 years into their lives. So what we were thinking about is how we can build a building that can survive all those horrible conditions, social conditions, I mean, and economic situations. Well, the book starts with a story of the year 2010 when when Skolkovo was initiated as a project, and it discusses various aspects of coexistence between the society and urban environment, new events and new discoveries. So the building was constructed within a very short time, within 2 years. The concept, the stage P, the detailed design. What's interesting that the book took exactly the same amount of time to be written, and the third very interesting thing about it is that it's the lifetime of a very short lifetime in modern architecture. For instance, if we take a luminescent tube, then a book and the lamp, the tube, they are the same in terms of their lifetimes. Like concrete can survive thousands of years because it's a very long life material, but other materials, buildings die one after another, and this point really affected the design of our building, and it also affected the ideas of how this building should be built. So everything rests on the skeleton of the building, if you will, and all the other elements are hung later on the frame. And the Hypercube is a transformer kind of building which allows us to change the inside of the building in order to accommodate various functions, various needs, and you can also change the outside. The very aesthetics of this building is not traditional. It's not about what the architecture is thinking or the artist is thinking by placing elements relative to each other on the facade or inside the building. This building is about the engineer's thinking. It's about what the engineer is thinking, or the building itself is thinking, in order to become super efficient and survive all sorts of circumstances. So for these reasons, we did not accentuate, or we did not emphasize aesthetics in this building too much, because quite different set of criteria were relevant to us, but we tried to design the building in a way that all the materials that are used in this project be a continuation or be continuations, natural continuations of engineering or rational thought. I think that this is the first actual really working high-tech building in Russia. We used cutting-edge technologies in terms of energy efficiency. For instance, each facade is a unique combination of various materials, such as glass panes, and they are selected and positioned in a way to reflect the sunlight. And the facade itself is a very complex structure, complicated structure. It involves a lot of technologies, such as EV systems, in order to make use in the facade the information technology component, and to build a building, to construct a building that would not be just beautiful, but a building that would exude something, that will transmit something to the outside world. So we used a lot of materials to build the skin or the shell of this building, and the shell is supposed to change over a period of time. For instance, in most cases, facades serve for 25 years, but we are going to continue this experiment and see whether or not we want to replace the outer shell more frequently. Also, we experimented with the lighting, with light conduits that deliver light from the outside into certain spaces inside the building that are less lead than others. So that was the story. So if you want a more detailed story, I'm prepared to provide you with a more detailed description. But of course, with time, architecture will stop to become bespoke architecture oriented only toward the thoughts of the architect or the artist. At first it will become a mix of engineering approach and an artistic solution, and then at the end of the day I think that engineering will win and there will be a startup which architecture will be created without an architect.
Just by following certain targets.
Thank you for bringing the question of research and also how important the publication and the analysis of this building has been. Something that for sure we're going to continue in the after discussion. Now we continue with Reina de Graaff, partner at the Office of Metropolitan Architecture, a practice that takes research as a very important starting point of the projects. So Rainier, tell us more about how you see the future from your practice.
Thank you. I believe this session is called News from the Future, Architecture Materials, Building Technologies of the New Era. I haven't got a presentation of our own work, but rather I have a very general observation on the subject, which I would like to share. This was modern architecture in 1948. I guess you could call this, at that particular point in time, the architecture of the future. This is the architecture of the future today. That begs a certain question. This was the modern interior of the future in 1948. That's the interior of the future today. I could go on with probably hundreds of slides with the same unfair comparison, but I guess all I need is these four. For me, there is a very interesting contradiction at play in architecture at the very moment. If you look at the Farnsworth House, and you would apply LEED or BREEAM or all the kind of systems of sustainability standards we have on it, it would probably constitute an ecological crime. The second house is an ecological masterpiece. It does all the things these lists insist on, and therefore you could say this is bad and this is good. And I kind of wonder in terms of, well, my education, presumably the education of the other people around the table as well, where does that leave us? And in my observation, architecture suffers from a very detrimental mentality as a whole at the moment. Sustainability, if you analyze the word, back to Latin, it essentially means keeping things the same. Modern architecture is dedicated to change in its mission. Since the Enlightenment, there are roughly two views on nature. This is a drastic simplification, but we've only got 5 minutes. So there are those who see man as part of nature, and therefore the intervention in nature of man as a legitimate part of nature. Then there is the romantic reaction, which sees nature as either as an absolute ideal, and if it doesn't really behave as an absolute ideal, it sees nature as the punishment of God to man. In either case, there is a kind of subservient reaction of man to nature. And I have the feeling that the emphasis on sustainability and on the whole marks a regression back to a kind of romantic ideal of nature, particularly if you compare this to really modern projects of like Buckminster Fuller at the end of the 60s, which were geared towards addressing environmental issues on a very, very large scale through design. This kind of architecture insists almost on a reclusion of man in a kind of modest behavior, a kind of submissiveness of nature that I think is fundamentally anti-modern. So what was the future was modern, and what is the future is in a large things anti-modern. I don't have really an answer as a whole, but it's a kind of a dilemma I would like to share with the other speakers and the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Renier. For sure that this is a very provocative set of images that make us wonder, like, which was our image of the future in the past, and to apply that critical view to what we think that the future is today, something that we're going to take after this last presentation by Marco from Delano. The built environment, sorry. Today, there are many startups really having a deep impact on how we live, but architecture has been not benefit from this kind of scalability approach because of its own characteristic of singularity. And Delano has found the key to perhaps parametricize and finally apply this scalability mindset of a startup to architecture. So please, Marco, tell us more about Delano.
Hello, I'm a co-founder and chief architect of the Delano project. We have launched last year. Yesterday we have a big launch of a new product. Our idea is that we want to put architecture in the hands of a consumer and to go to the places where architects usually don't go. This is how typical Moscow flat looks. And if you want to change it, you have a big problem. You're going in big trouble because you're going in a big construction site. You need to do all on your own. You need to become a designer, an expert in concrete, and all that stuff. What is the future? What is my report from the future? With us, you go to our website, you press a button, you write what every human being knows about his house, its address, the size of its house. After that, you have a final price of total reconstruction of your flat, which is calculated through our very complex system based on a databases on all flats in Moscow. You have a modern style, you have a little bit more expensive classic style, and you have a way to make it your own. You go to the constructor, we call it, and then you have a very easy interface to become an architect. Architects do all the dirty work. We find the good colors, good materials, and all stuff that combines, and then you can play like in the Sims game and to choose how your flat will look. It works better than this clicker. You can choose the color of your walls, you can choose doors, you can choose your floor, you can choose plugs, you can choose how your toilet will look, and if you see, there is in the right corner at the bottom, you see the price of that house, of the total reconstruction of flat. And in 50 days or 75, depends on the house, your flat will look like this. Well, next step, you choose some options like in a car, what you want to add, like air conditioning. Then you choose the date when you want to start the works, and when you see the date when it will be finished, you write us your phone, we call you, then you go to the vacation, maybe in a Venice for Biennale. Then we come in, we do all the dirty work. We have the special system that organize it, and we do the same problem that you have with the very poor condition of construction workers and all of this stuff. Then you get this quality of every finishings and all the details, which we have because we do all the construction site like in fabric on a conveyor, but there's a lot of these conveyors in Moscow right now. Then your flat look like this. This was how it was looking before you come to our website, and this is it. And then you have a happy life. You move in. This is Masha and Ton. They're living in our first flat, and then they do all the beautiful stuff. They bring all the pictures, flowers, some nice furniture, and they have all the pictures like in a Pinterest. Is it the future? We think yes, but it is the reality. We started last year without this constructor stuff, but only with 2 styles. It was even more, I'll say it straightforward, like architects liked it. And we have already done 78 constructions in Moscow, and we're still going forward. And we think that this is the future where architect can influence not only the masterpieces and the center buildings and some, I don't know, iconic buildings, but the way when we can make some knowledge, put it in a system, as Facebook is doing it and other startups, and then put it in the hand of a consumer, and then can decide what they want to have the future in their flat or maybe other things. So this is it.
Thank you, Marco. It is very interesting to see architecture applied as an online service, but it is only possible thanks to the modularity of the Soviet buildings that allow you to deploy the same model on thousands of apartments here in Moscow. Well, Hani doesn't have a presentation, but will participate in the discussion. After seeing these presentations, I want to propose a starting point, especially after the strong images from Rainier.
I do have a presentation.
Ah, you do have a presentation?
Without slides.
Ah, okay, so please. Yes, for sure, Hani.
No, I have just a few things to say before you ask questions. I run a lab in Vienna called the Deep Futures Lab, which is basically at the University of Applied Arts University of Applied Arts in Vienna at the Angewandte. We've been doing for 4 years, research in what we call the deep future. It's not necessarily the future of tomorrow or of today, but out of it we are bringing back mementos. I took a vacation in the deep future a little while ago, and I had to sign an NDA, so I couldn't take pictures, which is why I don't have any slides. But there are 5 key parameters or 5 key points that I think keep coming up as we do our studies on the future of transportation, the future of building, the future of cities, the future of spaces, of domesticity, and whatever it might be. And I'll just run through them quickly. One of them is robots. Robots are, at the moment, a kind of fearful thing we're seeing. There's something that's being developed in there's a lot of talk about robots being evil and potentially out of control, but there's also a lot of interesting things that robots are able to do. Robots will bring, it seems to me, and we're already seeing this happening in some of our practices and some of our work, will change the way we fabricate and the way we construct architecture, that's for sure. I mean, in fact, if you were to deploy robots in your project, it would be kind of interesting to see what would happen. Delivery systems, robots are particularly good at moving things. So the notion of robots, I don't know if anyone saw my presentation this morning, but the project we're doing in China where robots are embedded into the walls of new buildings to allow goods to be delivered or allow waste to be removed. So they'll have a kind of an impact on the way we design domestic space and other spaces. Robots will be deployed in repair and recovery and the changing of buildings. Robots are very much part of mobile infrastructure as it changes as we go forward. So in some ways you could call an autonomous car a robot. Number 2, I have 5, so your timer's going, is intelligence. Intelligence is a big word. We hear a lot of it, but I think when it comes to architecture and cities, we're beginning to see the use of intelligence at the level of things like embedded sensors, the notion of smart environments. We're hearing a lot about that these days. Ecosystems. You see a lot of work coming out of California, especially with Google and Apple trying to do, and Cisco trying to do the integrated domestic space where everything is talking to each other. Again, the interesting thing about talking about the future is that it sits on the precipice between, or on the kind of moment between potentially fantastic and potentially very detrimental and strange. And that's what's interesting about thinking about it. The idea of responsive environments that change according to your needs. There's a lot of talk about that. And data management and modification and the use of data, and we heard some of that this morning, and the use of big data in the way we design cities and spaces. Number 3 is what I call plug and play. Plug and play is the idea, is particularly evident now in the beginnings of prefabrication. We're seeing a lot of interesting innovation in prefab. Prefab is definitely in the future horizon now. It's been a dream way back in the same period as you saw the Farnsworth House. In terms of potentially building, and it goes back to Buckminster Fuller, goes back to many architects who've used it and thought about it, especially in Japan and other places. But today, because of all these other let's say, interference and convergence of all these technologies, prefab is becoming a very viable and interesting aspect to the idea of plug and play. And with that comes things like integrating technologies and technologies that integrate with your prefab. And then, of course, notions of environmental sustainability. I'm not so sure that your house that you saw in the future is the one I want to live in. But the idea that that we become more sensitive to the questions of sustainability in the environment and use prefabrication and technologies to do that. The last one, or the second to last one, is transformation. That's tied to plug and play, smart materials, kinetics, solar and wind technology and harnessing, and recycle technologies. They're all part of that, taking a house, breaking it down, and then reusing the materials, and particular materials that are very good for that. And finally, the last one, and this is the weirdest one in my trip into the deep future, where they didn't let me take any pictures at all, I couldn't even, is privacy and pleasure. Now, it's not something you hear about often in a technological framework, but it's very, very important to us as human beings living in the future. And where do we sit in the face of robotics, intelligent environments, interfaces, and a world that, as you heard this morning from one gentleman, where big data begins to run everything around us. And in fact, there's another way of looking at big data, which is that it's an absorption of every single like, preference, and desire we have put into a package so that we can be packaged and sold. So what comes along with privacy and pleasure are haptics, intelligence and haptics in space. You think of the Oculus Rift and VR and the beginnings of what's coming out of that, and the question there is, how does VR work with our built environments? Off the grid is probably the most interesting aspect of this in terms of pleasure and privacy. And finally, two big mitigating factors that aren't talked about very much: nature and sex. And I'll close with that.
Thank you, Hani, for going through all these terms, that some of them for us are very concrete, perhaps robots.
What was your number 4? Sorry.
Number 4 was
Intelligence, plug and play.
Transformation.
This very concrete image of the future, but then you start to enter into some that for us will be more abstract, as you say, nature, sex, privacy, that for sure are going to be challenges for us in the next years. To get the discussion going, I want to planteate a question. I want to start with you, Renier. After this image that you show about the fans' workhouse, that if you look at it today, it would be a crime. Today, globalization is showing us a very specific image of progress that we are seeing all across the emerging economies, populated with these tall glass skyscrapers, because that is the image of progress, and it's what they want. So as architects, how do we play the role of telling them that maybe progress is not that image and could be something perhaps more related to the second image that you show?
Well, but this is a hugely contentious issue. Because yes, you can tell all the emerging nations that they shouldn't have skyscrapers, they shouldn't have curtain walls, etc. When you're doing that, you generally, and that's the irony, you're denying them the bad behavior which you amply permitted yourself half a century earlier. So there is something, there's an element of good advice in it, there's something innately patronizing in it, because you're essentially denying them a way of life which you enjoyed, because now that you have to share it with so many more people has become unsustainable. And for me it's very interesting, if you look at if you do a little linguistic analysis on sustainability, for instance on its metaphor Spaceship Earth by Buckminster Fuller. I think that metaphor was, of course, launched in the Bible, but it was first launched by Howard George, then later by George Orwell. And the metaphor of a ship, the Earth being a ship, there was always a thing about being prudent with resources on the one hand, but there was also an element of equal sharing. And the two went hand in hand. If you look at modernism and its existence minimalism, it is both a form of prudent use, because you don't use too much, but it's also driven by a very political notion of equal sharing. When you don't have more than I do, I also may not crave for more. And the image of progress that is currently being presented is a rat race in the context of the market economy, which is driven by competition, which is based on having more than somebody else. So precisely at the moment that there is a system where we in a way have introduced a race towards whatever, to then in a way advocate prudent use to developing nations, in their eyes is denying them development. In their eyes is denying them the development with the ulterior motive that we stay ahead. So the fact, I think you cannot talk about sustainability without also talking about solidarity. And we always talk about the one and never about the other. And that's, I mean, I know there is more intelligent architecture produced today than the kind of hut I showed. I mean, I assume the irony, but I showed it because it's the kind of architecture produced in the name of sustainability. And I find a lot of architecture produced in its name is such a horrible demonstration of good intentions, while the evidence points to the impossibility of those good intentions.
Well, for sure that you have been able to work in a very particular context, as Renier says, because in China, the rapid development has happened in very few years, and you've been in the middle of working on this. An example like Ordos, the city that now we see in the media that is like still empty, that was planned only a few years ago, and where you took part building this museum that materialized the image that the city wanted to have in the future. How do you deal with this desire of all of those to be a city with an identity, and what you had to provide in that aspect?
Yes, when we are invited to do this competition in Ordos, then we took to the empty site. Like they said, this is your site. Like it's gonna be like 7 cultural building in 5 years or something like this. This is a reality what we facing in China, like 10 years back. Then also they already finished this building. We can't stop. So we have to live with this. So if you don't do it, somebody else is gonna do it. So that's at that moment we are very amazed at what's going on. Then, like we seen this same thing happening everywhere in China. So that makes us, this is not about China, but it's gonna be everywhere in the world. So that's why we came to back. So now we really have to have the vision for the future city. So not about talking about the individual building, like how it's gonna be like this, but at least we have to show our attitude, what the future urban space should be, how the environment should be. Like at least using our project, we have to deliver some message from our side for the people. So this is only way, this is only media which we architect can use. This is a building which invite like normal people has no idea what's the future about the city, but they come here, enjoy the space, enjoy this public space. That's why I didn't have time to show this Ordos museum. The challenging was the endurating this the plaza on the ground, which most of the surrounding normal people come in the night time, they sit, they find how their body fits to this landscape. They really enjoy like this. Then also like Opera House, we made the public pass, people can come here without buying ticket going inside, but they can climb to the top then see what is all the city. So that's why this like cultural building is not about only for the people come here with purpose, but for the people like living there to really become part of the notion of the future city. So that's, I think this is step by step, it's gonna be like changing their mind. I think this is a kind of very small step, but I think we have to keep doing it. So that's why we are trying to build our vision for the future city, like with many other architects, but like we try to use individual project to respond, to show some idea for it.
Well, sadly, I've been asked to stick to the timing, so we're not going to have more time for questions. But for me, all your presentations, and especially all these terms that you put at the end, leave me with many questions in my head that I hope to see how each of you continue developing in your work in the future. So thank you for...
We really have to stop?
Yes.
Really? They're gonna... That's crazy. We just started.
А можно еще важный момент?
May I point out, may I make one very important point? I really liked Renier's utterance to the effect about the etymology of the word sustainability and the etymology of its translation into Russian. I would like to suggest the correct Russian translation, because it's usually mistranslated as sustainable development. And the sustainable development can be viewed from many perspectives. And the economic part of sustainable development, like a fight for more, is wrong. I have a very simple word. This word comes from the field of mathematics, and I would suggest that it be accepted as the correct translation of sustainability. It's the necessary and sufficient. So these ideas define the future of architecture, the future of the urban environment, and the normal behavior of human beings in relation to the environment and in relation to each other. Thank you very much.
They tell us we cannot continue. So, Hani, because maybe I think you wanted to say something.
No. I have not. I said a lot. I think. I think it's just interesting that just this idea that the sins of the father, I guess, is the way you can put it, right? That we enjoyed a certain modernist kind of ethic in our discipline, but all of a sudden it's not for the next generation. It's a little bit like what's just happened in Great Britain politically, which is kind of tied to that kind of sentiment and thinking, and I think it's something we need to be aware of generationally. I remember sitting at Harvard teaching with Rem Koolhaas. I was very young. Rem was older than me at the time. I'm catching up. And Rem said to me over lunch, he didn't say very much, but at one point he turned to me in the middle of his fish and his swimming, and he said, your problem with your generation is you haven't taken my generation out of the picture. And I was like, wow, okay, I have a job to do. And I think that that's a kind of interesting sort of way to think also about the future, is that generationally there's we have to be careful that the generation, we were reacting to the generation of Rem's group, which essentially was reacting to modernism, right? And we, in fact, have pushed the envelope in other ways. And we're the generation, I guess, myself, Greg Lynn, others that have been at Columbia with me years ago and now in other places, have brought technology, and we're the ones who kind of were there at the beginning of computing, right? Now there's another generation, a couple of them. And the question is, what is the radical position of the future of the next generations to basically continue to push the equation further into the future? And what worries me a little bit, and this has happened in the last few biennales, is that there's a little bit of it's not apologetic, but there's a little bit of a backseat position, which I find a little bit precarious.
I completely concur. I mean, I find if we have 90 more seconds, I completely concur.
Can we get T-shirts like that? Time is up. I like it.
No, I mean, the thing particularly about this Biennale is that it looked so much for a legitimacy for architecture outside architecture. And whenever you do that, you make yourself submissive to criteria which you haven't shaped. And after the 44th AIDS clinic in Africa, after the 100th kind of bamboo refugee camp, after the 88th recyclable bottle wall, I sort of thought to myself, and then I actually saw an old exhibition of Zaha Hadid on the other end of Venice. And it was wonderfully politically incorrect, but boy was it beautiful. Yeah. And boy did it rely on a kind of image of the future that was indigenous and self-created.
Oh, I think there's got to be a healthy line drawn through the middle of those two extremes. That's where we sit, if you ask me about the future. We have to find the elegance, the beauty, but also the intelligence and the kind of relevancy to the human condition. And we have to find that mix. It's imperative. We can't just go on building monuments to ourselves as architects and enjoying, sort of reveling in that, because it's not interesting anymore. But at the same time, I think if we overdo I'm socially responsible, I'm environmentally, sensitive, I'm boring, and we have to be careful. Anyway, I'll let you close up, because that guy's losing his mind.
It seems that we have to empty this for the next discussion, but thank you very much. Because of the intensity of the discussion,
well, let's do this again somewhere.
We put very good questions, or we can continue the reception later on with some champagne. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.